This is William Scully from Bennington, Vermont, on the workshop on hydropower.
Right. To give you a little bit of an idea who I am, I own several businesses, and on September 26, 2008, I actually had that moment people would describe as an epiphany that changed my life by asking the question. I was driving along the Farmington River in Connecticut, although I might have been in Massachusetts at that point in time, and listening to NPR talk and a talk about how oil prices were going to reach $4.58 a gallon. I mean, it was the highest, since what was it, the oil embargoes of the 70s. And I had this epiphany. There's 5 dams in the stream behind my house. Why am I not driving, an electric car right now that's powered by my backyard? Which then began a very long adventure that started the next day into why that wasn't the case. And I learned at that point in time that Vermont had not done a hydro redevelopment in 28 years. And in fact, it was 35 years before 2 of us managed to get 2 of them back online. To put a scope and scale to that and what that means for the local economy, there are, at that point in time, there was 1,254 unused registered dams in the state of Vermont. Enough power certainly to power a state that was once powered by hydropower. Looking at the town of Bennington, which is, the town has an annual budget of $14.5 million, I believe, and there's 15,000 people. That's $100 million a year that leaves the area that we just export to foreign countries. So to put a number on local economies that are struggling, electing not to make that not the conversation is ludicrous. So I then began this whole thing. I ended up building what I believe is the only hydropower plant, definitely in the country, but probably in the world, that got over the hump and actually improved the aquatic habitat as a function of redevelopment, as a function of operation, which was in part, I think, a lot to do with my education and the people that I knew who helped me to put together right from the outset a group of stakeholders that allowed me to build a project, and rather than fighting all of the stakeholder interest and trying to do the least I could do to try to embrace all of those concerns, and rather than make them ideological divides, to turn them into design concerns. So we built an incredibly unconventional plant and started to point out some of the liabilities with public trust waterways and how vested rights of people with flowage rights could start to converge to improve the aquatic habitat. I guess it was a year and a half ago, or not a year and a half ago, but November of 17, we recommissioned a second plant that had been out of commission almost exclusively because of PCB contaminations, and that's a river that is actually, we think, contaminated from North Adams, Massachusetts, flows through Vermont, and then dumps all those PCBs into New York State, which New York is less than happy about, given all the GE cleanup of the Hudson. And we recommissioned that one, and one of the things we started to learn is that as a byproduct of redevelopment, we were actually cleaning the toxins up in the river. And you look at all these river cleanups. Lake Champlain in Vermont is now a big deal, and all of climate change is raising the temperatures such that farm runoff is starting to make these waters degrade. And so we started trying to pose a different solution to Vermont, and rather than penalizing or taxing our ways through the problem, perhaps this is a development problem. In many ways similar to looking at it like the New Deal in some ways, in that you can build infrastructure that feeds off the natural landscape in a way that isn't detrimental, and all of the stakeholders can benefit from that. Some of the outcomes of that thinking are the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act in a lot of ways addresses the public trust of water as it goes downstream, reuse being a vital part of that. Much in a New Deal kind of way, looking at this thing and trying to figure out how the larger infrastructure problem works out. So, what I want to talk to you about today, because hydro is probably, I think, described by attorneys as the most complex of all environmental subjects. Hydropower relicensing is crazy, so I'm going to deal with it in as simple a way as I can. So the use of water really, we've lost a little bit of meaning, and in the classes I teach about this, I try to talk about the right to use water used to be called a privilege, and now we call it a license, and I think that we lost something there in the definition, because it is actually a privilege to be using public trust, and it should be handled in that way. So, in foreign countries, I mean, wars are fought over the use of water, but we have so much of it here, we just elect not to use it and then wonder why we have no cash. So, and we have no, not a lack of funding for infrastructure. So part of the privilege is the right to use that locally and to look at the natural environment and natural resources and retain the energy. And that's actually what it is, the energy that's flowing through the places that we live in this region of the world all the time. It gets a little complex. In the overarching, I can get into the licensing stuff if people want, but I'm going to breeze over it and just talk about really what happens is that you're going after something that's a federal license. It's federally jurisdictional under the Federal Power Act, which went through a series of transformations in the early 20th century. And that also locks in with the 72 Clean Water Act. So the state then would vest its rights in the Clean Water Act, which then they become codified in a federal license, and the whole project becomes federally jurisdictional then. I'm going to leave it at that really high level of that's how these things are administered on a regulatory basis. And if anybody really wants to know more, I actually finished a paper last year where I started to talk about how we're managing the Clean Water Act. Actually, we're mismanaging it, and it's an inadequate tool to the concerns of today because there's no acknowledgement of the ability for water quality to improve. It's not actually in the Clean Water Act. It's not a tool. It's an emissions-based, and it's effective because it's emission-based, but it's also limited. Also, climate change, not something that was ever conceived of when they were drafting this stuff. So if you're interested in more, I can get into that. I want to mention also that one of the things that if you want to know more, we may be teaching some workshops on how to look at local hydro so that you could come in with a site and you would leave knowing, I'm going to show you how to do this, but it would be actually doing it. Leave knowing how you could proceed. If you thought that there was an asset that could be developed, you could look at that in a very small amount of time with a very small investment and say, this is what it's worth. Which I think this is the mystery of that people can't get to. So I'm just going to give you the equations, which are very simple. You only need two numbers. To look at a dam, you need two numbers to know what the production of that plant's going to be. So all you need to do is transfer the head and the flow into horsepower, and then you can bring that into kilowatt, and suddenly, times 24 and times 365, you can start to work on your annual generations. So without further ado, I think too, one of the things to think about too when we talk about privileges and all the maps of Turner's Falls, which I'm assuming you're all very familiar with, there's this big water canal that runs through, and it's a very good example of how collectively within a community people share the value of something so that the better it's built and the better it's managed, the better everyone makes out, all the way down the line to the person just working the factory line. So, where did I begin with this thing? So let's start to talk about first renewable energy. So a backdrop to this whole thing is I think we can hit our goals of 90 and 100% if we can just get to working on it. But let's just go high level. How does renewable energy work? So how does it work within a grid? So dealing with the big stuff, you're really going to know, and I'm sure you know about all these, but we have solar, we have wind, and we have hydro. The lower right is actually the plant we finished in November of 2017. Solar obviously working off the sun, and keep in mind something called capacity factor. I don't want to go too far in the weeds, but capacity factor is something that's pretty important to this in that when you go to do capacity factor, the way you calculate, and it's a way of assigning a value to a region of how efficient is a particular technology. Solar in this region runs somewhere between 15 and 16% efficiency because you're getting about 4.2 peak hours of daylight at full production. So because the sun is passing overhead and because at night, if you have a 100 kilowatt plant, you're not making 100 kilowatts all the time. And I believe it averages about 4.2, at least for where I am in Vermont. So above the 42nd parallel and out in this region, you're going to get a capacity factor of plus or minus, say, 16%. Wind, I'm not going to quote, but I think it's somewhere between 20 and 30 is where wind lands because wind is intermittent. So what we know about those two technologies is that they function from different fuel sources, which is good because you need some level of dynamic in your energy plan. But they're both low outputs and they do very different things. That's one of the things I want to talk about. These do very different things. Hydro on the other plant, that plant right there runs about an 81% capacity factor, meaning we are running full tilt at 491 kilowatts all the time, 24 hours a day. So the production is that we end up making about 7 times as much power at the end of the day as the same capacity or horsepower or kilowatt plant. But that doesn't mean you can only go with one. But when you look at Vermont's energy grid, you can see that most of the energy grid is actually hydro. The interesting thing that's happened in Vermont, dissimilar from a Massachusetts problem, is that we have not forced utilities to divest from either distribution or generation. So all that's going to Canada, because the same company owns our 79% of our distribution grid and generates 82% of our power. The same parent company owns GMP and Hydro-Quebec. So anyway, most of it's hydro anyway. So Vermont actually ends up having this really great renewable portfolio. However, all of it's generated out of state, which is not good for the local economy. It's generated under foreign standards, so it likely doesn't really qualify as a renewable energy source, which is something we'll get into. But just to give you an overview, that's about how Vermont's energy grid lays out. Now to go into the weeds, because I want to talk about the balance between the importance of solar versus the importance of hydro, because they're both equally important within a grid, but they both do two very different things, which is where legislators tend to get very confused. Solar happens to do something really important in that it attacks something called peaking. It addresses it directly and effectively. Peaking tends to happen, I think in Vermont, between 11 and 2:30 is when most of the peaking occurs. And peaking is when the use goes up. Air conditioners are on, everybody's in their office, all these things are happening using a lot of electricity. And that's conveniently when the sun is right overhead, when solar can do the most good. So during this little bubble in the middle of the day, we have this massive spike in our energy use every day. And solar is actually, it's not the only, but it's a very good tool and probably my preferred tool for dealing with peaking. And what that does, the direct result of that, when you have an energy spike, utilities have to provide energy for that. They fire up a coal plant, fire up a fossil fuel, like a natural gas or propane plant, because you can't just fire up the nuclear plant up and down, up and down. You can also defer to firing up hydro plants, but you're again no longer into renewable energy because you're not running as a run-of-river, which we'll get into that a little bit later too. So for the renewable choices, solar actually just happens to be the best. However, where does the other 80-85% of your actual usage come from? So in this case, we're talking about needing a spike in the instant use. You need a sudden burst of power, but it's not what I would call the base load. It's the 24-hour cycle of things that are always running that you need a massive amount of production, okay? Again, getting into the difference between a solar and a hydro plant, the solar is producing 4.2 hours a day, the hydro is producing 24 hours a day. You have a different unit of production on the same size, same capacity unit. I hope nobody's glazing over yet, right? So solar, again, is very important, but it does something very different. It attacks peaking and not base load power.
Did you say 4.5 hours solar?
I think it's 4.2. And I think that's on, that was a study done a while ago. But, and that's, again, a little further north than here.
Yeah.
I think it was actually Burlington, Vermont. You get, off a non-tracking array, you get 4.2 peak hours of daylight. Which will get into kind of when I talk about the energy terroir, what Vermont's doing is going, solar, great, let's just put it in everywhere, which is Arizona's energy plan. That's not Vermont's energy plan, because the same solar panel, it's a good time to talk about production, that very same solar panel yields you twice as much production in Arizona or California or Florida or any of those places than it does here. So while you can keep generating, it costs you, well, you get half as much production, which you could infer that it costs you about twice as much to make every kilowatt hour, which then is not good for everybody paying their utility bill, because your utility bills just go up for a very long time. So somebody took, I really wish I could remember who did this. I want to say this was somebody out of Yale that took the time to do the Solutions Project, which if you Google Solutions Project, it's really cool. You can pick all this data. I've chosen their model right now as an example of how would you look at, for the United States, what would the energy mix look like if you were shooting for 100% renewable energy? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to show you kind of one thing that we can distill out of this is that you can achieve it, but you need to look at the mix that you need, which is the term I've been trying to develop, which is the energy terroir. What are the resources you have to work with? Because you can't just pick a resource and use it if it doesn't fit where you live. So for Vermont, let's just look right now at only two things. Offshore wind, 0, right? There's no coastline. Hydroelectric, 64.4. But let's look at how that shakes out against Massachusetts. Offshore wind, best model is actually 55% offshore wind because you can do deep, and this is really deep offshore wind. The wind blows all the time and it actually provides constant energy. And hydroelectric, 1.4%. So starting to think about, and starting to think about how you put that together, and the further you are from the coast, the more you're going to want to invest in solar and hydro as energy sources, because there's a cost of transmission. There's a line loss. You're actually giving off heat and you lose power as you transmit it over great distances. So that's a factor in this, that the further you are from that offshore wind source, the more you want to think about an alternative. Now, I can't say that these numbers are right, but I put them up there to offer as example because when you develop a grid, the things within that grid and within that system really matter, the natural resources do. So how does hydroelectric work? I like this drawing. So you have water at a higher source that flows through, and all this is going to do is spin a turbine. I'll show you what turbines look like. There's a lot of different varieties for different applications. And then it's just charged through a draft tube that creates some suction. It's spinning, depending on how you do it, a flywheel or whatever that is, that's going to spin a generator and send it out to the grid. It really is just spinning a wheel, spinning a flywheel. The technology, other than we involve electricity, hasn't changed much since water wheels. The water just spins something and you're trying to harness the energy from that. You're trying to transition that horsepower into whether it's a water hammer or an electric generator. All you're doing is transferring energy. That's it. That water represents power, and you're trying to capture that power and convert it into a useful tool for whatever it is you happen to be doing. So one thing, and I don't want to go too technical, but it's important to know that there are actually different types of hydro. There's more than I'm going to cover here. But it's good to know what they are. Vermont Tissue Plant. This is the one I was talking about before that we commissioned to improve the water quality. Part of that is the fact that the plant's on right now, but there's water going over the dam. This is a run-of-river project. In simplest terms, outflow equals inflow at all times. We don't store water. But if we did store water and we were like the Hoover Dam, suddenly we are not a renewable energy source. Yes?
Sorry, could you repeat the name of this kind of
Run-of-river.
run-of-river?
Mm-hmm. So then you get into conventional storage, which is build a big dam. You let it keep filling. When you need, like during a peak demand, high usage, whatever it is, you turn on turbines in sequence. You keep turning on more and more until you've met your demand. And then at night, you slowly turn them back off and your reservoir starts to positively fill. One of the bigger problems with that is it's so reliant on water that you'll find that like Hoover and Glen Canyon are at, I think, less than half their actual design head height, so they aren't making much power anymore. And there are a lot of reasons why that's not a renewable energy source. There's a downstream cost because you're raising and lowering the water level. There's an upstream cost. You get algae blooms, which actually give off CO2. So it's way too much to go into here, but suffice to say that as a general rule of thumb, the Department of Energy does not consider storage to be a renewable energy source, storage of this kind. Then we get into what I think you're going to find is going to be, you're going to start to hear about a lot more about this over the next 10 years. Pump storage. This isn't the best example because I've actually, I wanted a nice picture, but you can see that there's water here and there's water here. That's what I wanted to convey. If that wasn't connected to a river on the bottom, it would be considered from a regulatory standpoint as same as a Tesla wall. It's a private battery storage system. You have a turbine, and that turbine is taking water from a low source and using a technology like solar. Running the turbine as a pump, because a motor can turn in either direction, running the water up the hill, and it sits there until you need it, at which point in time the gates open and you use that as a generator rather than a motor. And you generate power, immediate, massive amounts of power on demand. This is where everything is going to go, because eventually somebody's going to start to, yes?
Isn't that what we have at Turner's Falls?
Turner's is different. Turner's, I don't know if you have that at Turner's.
Northfield.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are two in New
But it's
England. One of
Northfield
them
that
is
goes
around
there and
here.
then runs over the Turner's Dam.
Yep, you're correct. Yep. So there are two that I know of. One I think is off the LIE, and the other one is right around this area. I've never been there. They are not common. They're going to be common because eventually somebody's going to ding the bell and go, solar put in a battery is no longer a renewable energy source. Because it isn't. Because you have the byproduct of the lithium battery. That hasn't happened yet, and that's great because that's what I'm doing at my house. But eventually somebody's going to do that. And what will happen then is now you have an absolutely, although there will be environmental impacts above and below, what you do is you do what Germany's done is you go find abandoned strip mines. And you use abandoned strip mines where the environment has been totally decimated, and you start to repopulate that in a way that has certain parameters. This is the kind of thing Vermont's starting to contemplate now. Vermont's looking for pilot projects. The developers, all of the developers, if you were to look it up, you'd find, I don't know how many people looking for pilot programs, because everybody knows this is the next logical step to get off of fossil fuels, because some days it's cloudy and you can't rely upon that. Not only that, but you have droughts where you can lose hydro. And I think it's southwestern Australia. About 3 months ago, I read an article, and I think it's over a huge distance, like 300 miles. They used a bunch of depressed areas along a river, and they filled them all such that they can run for 90 days in a straight drought. They have enough stored power to power that region for 90 days with no water, which is really impressive. And so in that sense, that's not really addressing peaking. They're using it actually as a stored energy system. So there's a lot of options here, but what I'm trying to point out is the cost is almost nothing. There's no byproduct for this. You're simply storing weight to be converted into energy whenever you want it. And I wish we had more of them. Yes.
Are you going to speak about the environmental impact of that? Because we have studies from the Connecticut River Conservancy showing the one in Northfield is devastating. The fish population, as well as you have to keep going down to the minute organism population. And it seems to be being ignored.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I need more specifics, but I'd be happy to do that at the end.
Yeah.
Definitely. So what are some types of hydroelectric turbines? I don't want to go too far in the weeds here because nobody's about to build a power plant, but just to breeze over, in general, there's really 5 different things here, even though it looks like 6. Don't be fooled. There's a Francis turbine, probably the most common type of turbine used in this country. There's a turgo, which is very similar to a Pelton. In both cases, you're going to have a water jet spinning a water wheel, essentially. The far bottom right, the cross flow, which was invented by a fellow whose name I'm not going to remember, around 1880 something in Germany, a fellow named Asperger. And Asperger they have a patent on it, and they still sell by far the most common, although people have been trying to improve on that design and get outside of the patent for hundreds of years, so over 100 years. And then in the middle you have a Kaplan. And in the bottom is really the type I tend to use for low head run of river because it gives you a massive operating range. It's a double regulated Kaplan. So our turbines at Vermont Tissue, we have 2 of them, and our operating range with 2 turbines goes from 21 cubic feet per second of water on up to close to 400. Francis is nowhere near that. It won't even turn on until 70 or 80 on the head that we have. So because those blades, the blades right here, can pitch, you can get the maximum amount of horsepower over a broad range of water so that you can generate, like as run of river, as the river flow goes up and down, this thing just constantly adapts and keeps the head on where it's supposed to be. So this is kind of how these all come together into an actual plant. The runner from this one typically sits in a spiral case. The water comes in and goes down. In this one you have a jet of water that spins that wheel. Here you have multiple jets. Over there you can see the water kind of comes in and spins that wheel. And here you have how a traditional Kaplan, fixed or otherwise, would work. And they all do very different things, so that in the center is really the best for super low head, which is where I am. Like, and if you get like in the 10 to 15, 18, 20 foot range, that's where you want to be. Whereas with rather than running this massive volume of water, there's this really neat thing that as a general rule of thumb, every foot of head that you increase gives you about 10% more power. To put some value to that, I think the infeed to the Reedsboro plant, so you have Somerset and, why am I blanking on the name? What's that? Harriman, thank you. The infeed to that is not substantially larger than the plants that I'm running that are 360 and 491 kW, but I'm running on, like, the highest head I'm running on right now is like 18 feet. And so I'm getting, to put this in, I'm getting under 500 kW on a river that when they use the same size coming out of Harriman, they're making 44 megawatts. Massive increase in power on the same amount of water, simply because there's so much head affecting that water that you end up with a huge amount of power. So head is a really critical component. So you see these little water jets here. I mean, this thing just sucks up a whole river into it. This one does. I mean, these take huge amounts of water, except for you look at this, and there's these little jets, these teeny jets, because you use a small amount of water with a massive amount of pressure behind it that then spins the wheel. So anyway, when you look at this, there's ranges in which these turbines tend to operate best depending on how much flow and how much head that you have. And I just kind of wanted to show, just as a general rule so people understand how this works, these are the ranges that you would typically try to use these different types of turbines. This is something you would figure out when you were designing your plant, but I find it fun to explain to people. So getting into the nitty-gritty, how would you identify the flow for a site? Now, I've talked about the fact that you need head and flow to figure out your horsepower, which then can be converted into kilowatt hour very easily, or kilowatts, excuse me, very easily. So it's great in this country because we have the USGS and it's all open source. Yes?
Very quickly, I'm having trouble with the definition of head.
Head, vertical feet between the bottom of the water and the top of the pond. I'm going to go back and show a slide again and show you. Head is simply the amount of gravity exerted, and you usually express that between the height of the headwater at the top of the pond and the tailwater at the bottom of the turbine. The distance between those 2 points is the head. And I will get back to it. Going into flow, so USGS is fantastic. I can tell you what the flow is right now on almost any river in this region. And I can tell you, like at Vermont Tissue, what it's been all the way back to like 1932, I think. So all of this information is stored and it's all easily accessible. So when I go to look at something like the Pownell plant, I know that there's a gauge here, and you can't really read it, it's a little out of focus, but I know that there's a gauge there. I can identify that gauge, and then I can just go find the basin characteristics or the data for that and pull that up. So I don't know if you can read it, but the drainage area for that gauge in Williamstown is 126 square miles of drainage area. That's the first number we need. 126 square miles drainage area at the area where USGS is taking all of their measurements. Then I go into another USGS program that identifies drainage area. Drainage area is simply the highest point all the way around like a crown, that when rain falls outside of it, it goes away. When it falls inside of it, it all goes into the same watershed or river. Even if it doesn't make it all the way to the river, it's within the watershed. And I can go on to USGS because USGS is just awesome, and I can click a point and I can ask them to tabulate the drainage area for that specific point on the river. In this case, when I did this 2 days ago, and it took me maybe like 90 seconds, I get 224 square mile drainage area. I now have the data I need to do what's called a retrograde algorithm and simply calculate the percentage of, what 126 is relative to 224, which now is still boring, but we're going to make that number kind of exciting. So then I can go on to USGS again, and I can say, okay, I need to develop some kind of understanding of what the river does. How frequently is the flow X or Y or whatever? And I can pull up all this data because going back over the entire history, I think this one goes back to 1944 or something like that. 1% of the time at that gauge, there's over 1,700 cubic feet per second. And I can start to look at this and figure out what all my flows are. And then I can convert those flows into something, and this looks very complicated and it's not, into a flow duration curve at the Pownell Tannery Dam. So I've taken the gauge data from 126 square miles, and I've converted that into a chart for 224 square miles. So I now know if I want to build this thing, I can pick a variety of things. Most people would build to the 85% exceedance, which surprisingly is 15% on the graph. 85% of the time, you're okay. And that's going to land me right around 800 cubic feet per second if I elect to build that, which is typically how you would build a run-of-river plant. We didn't build this one that way. But I now have a set of values, so now I can look at this and go, okay, I can make decisions on how much flow I want. Question number one, how much flow am I going to be working with? And so now we can make those decisions. And again, this whole project right here is probably, I don't know, like if I went up to a site and I didn't know anything about it, I can't imagine I would spend an hour on it, because it's all available data. So you begin to assess your site, and you now know how much water you have. And getting into head. So you would ask me a question about head. So in simplest terms, you have gross and you have net head. Gross head is just what it sounds like. It's just a distance of measurement. So you have a measurement from this point to this point, only vertical though. You're only worried about the vertical height, not the distance between the 2 points. You're worried about the distance in elevation. That gives you head. So once you measure that, and when you're looking at a dam, it's actually just measuring above the dam and below the dam. That's it. That's all there is to it. And usually on my own, I'm not a surveyor, but I'll go shoot those, and I can usually do them fairly accurately with a laser and a float and just a staff on the downstream end. I can land close enough to actually look at what I think a project's going to do without spending the money on a surveyor. And I've done this with classes where we'll go out and run, we'll build entire plants, and we won't hire anyone to do anything. We're just out there just doing it with a tape measure, low tech, and it's actually kind of fun. And now here's where the magic happens. You only need to put two numbers into either of two equations. Now these two equations always give me slightly different results, which is what I do most. And I think you'd find this is what a teacher would teach in college, and this is what anybody who builds hydro is going to use. They're always different. They're both legitimate numbers, and they're always off by like 1% or so. Like I never get the same result with them. But that's all it is. If you elected to go with 100 cubic feet per second, you then have a variety of constants and things that you can plug into this. Then you have a weight of water constant. Now you're going to put in your head in feet. I just picked 15 as a random number. Turbine efficiency, generator efficiency, belt efficiency. I actually gathered those from the plant that we just built. So if you really wanted to be conservative, you would shoot for, you could net those out to 85, 86%. Horsepower is a constant in this equation. So you're actually multiplying a bunch of things to get up to 550, which will then give you, we know at this point we have 156 horsepower at the turbine shaft, but we still need to get that to electricity. So then we have another constant, and we can get to converting horsepower to kilowatt, which is simple. You can do that on your phone. You can convert horsepower to kilowatt. It's a really basic formula, one thing times another. But then we just need to plug in generator efficiency, because the generator is going to have some resistance, and the generator is going to give off some heat, so we're going to lose a little power there. And then we're going to have our belt efficiency. In this case, I used a belt. If you use a direct drive shaft, you wouldn't have the number. It would be 100% rather than 98.5. But the final result is we're going to have 110.57 kilowatt at the shaft, which means if this ran 24 hours a day, if you had built this to way undersized it for your plant, you'd be at about 110 kilowatt, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Don't think you would build it that way, but in simplest terms, that's what you would have done. The other formula is similar. Again, it's more of an academic approach, and you still need to plug in a field number or that you would get from actual turbine efficiencies. And I think a conservative would be 85 if you were using less efficient equipment. I know that ours is 88.5, so I can just use that. Yes?
How does this relate to the seasons?
That would be, well, it depends on where you are, what you're building, and that's why you build to 85%. Typically, like you don't want to build it out to the maximum flow you ever have, because you have a lot of times when you're not going to have that flow, like end of July and August when the flow is low. And that's where I get into, it gets a little technical with the type of plant you're going to build at that point in time.
Okay.
And how much head you have. I mean, if you're dealing with a lot of head in a big reservoir, you just max the thing out all the time.
Yeah.
But for something like the Vermont Tissue Project, we built that to the 85% exceedance in a very, very classic manner, but we built it with incredibly efficient turbines with a really wide operating range. So we only need to meet our environmental flows, which I think are like 21 cubic feet per second off the top of my head, which is the flow. We have 2 dams, so the flow over 2 dams plus flow for fish passage. And once we meet that, the aesthetic and the aquatic flow at 21, we then need to make another 21 until we're operable. So when we hit 42 cubic feet per second, we come online. And if we looked at the flow duration curve for that, it's less than 1% of the time that we have that little flow. And the rest of the time it's just automated. It just follows the river flow. But it's, I think when I looked at it, that plant should have been running continuously, because it has no maintenance that would give it downtime for something like the past 18 months. It would never have shut down. So anyway, this is just trying to, this is about where the slides I prepared conclude. And I wanted to try to answer some more specific questions because I think that you all informing what I'm telling you, this is such a complex thing that I wanted to leave it like that, write down the formula, you can go figure it out for yourself, at least in a basic sense. But I kind of wanted to let you all direct where we go from here. Yes?
So the 110 kilowatts, that's how much power is being produced every hour, or?
That's how much you can produce with this particular model
Uh-huh.
if you chose 100 cubic feet per second and 15 feet of head. That's a really small river. Like that, I'm not sure it would even qualify as river, that might be creek. So I chose something very small.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could make 110.
In an hour? That's like, or what's the
Well,
unit
okay,
for
so
that?
here's
Just
where it
like
gets interesting. So kilowatt at the generator.
Okay.
And so that is a function of power. It's the same as saying horsepower. I mean, they're actually, the two are interchangeable. So kilowatt is the same as capacity is the same as horsepower. If you generated 110 and you ran for 1 hour, you would have generated 110 kilowatt hours, which is a sellable unit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a unit of production. So, and that's how we've elected to do that. So you have a unit of production after an hour of 110 kilowatt hours. If you wanted to monetize that in Vermont, including renewable energy credits, you would be doing 110 times something like 18 cents. So 110 times 18 cents would give you how much money you made in that hour. And then you can expand that out to your 24 hours and beyond that. Anybody's got a calculator. It's not that difficult. But that's where you'd land. Yes?
I hear a lot about dams that are not being used because they need better maintenance. They've been left into disrepair, and the machine, the turbine and the generator seems to be a very simple machine. Can you just speak a little bit to what that might be about?
Yeah, I think it has to do with, I think this is part of what the paper that I wrote was about, was trying to understand how we got to where we are, where you have clean water policy that ignores climate change and in-stream pollution. Like, it just isn't written for that. So you end up with rivers that are polluted. You end up with ignoring climate change as a mitigating factor of river health when it's probably pollution aside, now that that's kind of been dealt with. Pollution aside, climate change is the biggest threat to rivers, and we don't actually have a policy to deal with that at all. To the degree where Vermont has never actually told the Agency of Natural Resources to address climate change as a mitigating concern in river health. I mean, it's just been overlooked, and a lot of that has to do with how laws are written, that the legislators don't even realize they've overlooked it. But part of it is the fact that the way fundamentally we think about water and water rights and how water is managed doesn't address a lot of the concerns that are current concerns. That's part one. Part two is that there was a lot of hydro development in the 80s that, let's just say, the need for energy, this is in late 70s, 80s, things like that, and leading up to that, the need for energy far outweighed people thinking about the environment. So a lot of environmental standards were really low or just simply ignored altogether. And I think then as we headed into the 80s, really like 88, 89, 90, the pendulum swung in the other direction, such that it's not uncommon that Vermont hadn't licensed any new plants in 30-something years, because I think that's generally what you would find in New England. That from an environmental standpoint, people said, okay, hang on a second, like, we're just kind of running roughshod here, we need to back up. And we backed up so far that one of the second linchpins in that kicked in that during the Reagan administration, Reagan transferred the incentives for developing hydro from hydro to oil. Within 2 years of that, and people from Turner's Falls and Orange, Mass should know this, everybody in the country went out of business that was a turbine manufacturer. It wiped out an entire industry. And I mean like auto industry big. I mean huge industry decimated in 2 years. I think Rodney Hunt survived only in that they continue to make gates, and Leffel makes replacement products, and I think they're making a few new, but it just wiped out an entire industry. So then suddenly you're a country without an industry, which is why you go to Germany and there's hydro manufacturers all over the place and hydro everywhere because it's readily accessible. It's not in this country. So I think it was really the culmination, and there's probably other factors too, but it was a culmination of those two things really that left us to a point where you look at Vermont law, and the law has never been written in modern day to actually access renewable power. Title 10 is natural resources, Title 30 is utility commissions, And if you read Title 10, it says Title 30 is jurisdictional. And when you read Title 30, it says Title 10 is jurisdictional. I'm not kidding. In my paper, I cite the two. They cross-reference. And in the end, neither one's true. It's federally jurisdictional. But nobody's actually codified by law the way you actually license this stuff, which is insane. But that's the truth. Yes?
Yeah, my question's related to that. So, you know, I know in Canada, they have these massive, massive hydroelectric dams that are extremely ecologically destructive. Indigenous communities have fought against them because of the amount of land that's being destroyed. So, I mean, it seems obvious to me that with any renewable resource or even non-renewable resource, that scale has so much to do with whether or not a practice is environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable. So I'm wondering what your ideas are as a developer about how people like us, living in regions with a lot of hydroelectric potential, can sort of get ahead of big corporations, you know, like once the federal government sort of figures out that it's actually sitting on a ton of money, like how can we harness this technology so it's operating at the community level and is using, you know, small rivers at a sustainable scale, and it's not like big companies coming in and just shredding everything?
That's a really good question. Do we have an hour? I mean, I would love to answer that question in full detail, because it's a question that deserves a really good response. I'm going to give you, I'll start with by example. Okay, I don't know if I mentioned this. I think I mentioned the Bennington area and just what we're spending and exporting now, $100 million a year. Huge amount of money. I accessed 1% of that on my own, and I had never been near a hydro plant before. I just decided to do it because it made sense. And I think once people begin to do that, I also didn't do it for the money. That was a big difference too. I did it because I was like, this is insane. Like, why? It's flowing through town regardless of whether or not we it's falling over the dam regardless of whether or not we access it. So I think that part of that is that people need to get involved on an individual basis. The fact I can, on my own, access 1% of the power, and I didn't own any properties, and I still don't even, one of them I don't even own. I think that's my way, though, and that, like, if I see a problem, the way I tend to address it is to actually get my hands dirty and figure it out from the ground, like from a policy standpoint, from why is this the way it is? Oh, okay, I get it now. So I think a lot of it is people wanting to actually make a difference. And that isn't posting something on Facebook. It's actually going out and trying to learn something. And I think that there's a big confusion in most people's minds about how they're making change. And posting it on Facebook is simply not making change. So I think people actually need to put the social media down for a minute and go back and do this. I mean, there were unbelievable. I can't remember. There's something like, I'm trying to think of the scale. There's 87,000 registered dams in the country, if I think my memory is correct, that are registered. They think the number is actually closer to 2 million because so many of the farmers in the Midwest and out west actually just built dams throughout the 30s and 40s during the Depression. There was heat waves, there was massive die-off, so they were all building dams, and of course they were harnessing the energy off those dams. So
80,000, just sorry to interrupt you, so 80,000, there are currently 80,000 licensed.
87,000 registered dams. Now, does anybody want to guess how many of those we're using for power production on a percentage basis? Does anybody have a guess how many of those dams are used for or used in some way to generate energy?
5% now.
That's a good guess, but it's way too high. It's 3%. So when you look at the energy potential, I'll give you the answer I give everybody. We need to look at things on a community level and on a basin planning level, and we need to tear a bunch of dams out, and we need to develop a bunch of dams. But right now we're simply doing nothing other than arguing over ideology. Ideology doesn't get us anywhere. Ideology is the most damaging thing. When you have people like me who are trying to access renewable energy and address climate change, and the hardest fight I'm going to have is going to be with the environmentalists, that makes no sense. That's why Vermont Tissue worked out the way it is, because I said, okay, I'm trying to do this and you're trying to do this. How can we build this to satisfy your concerns? And it's why the next dam downstream I supported taking out, because the problem is everybody gets hung up on ideological divides rather than looking at the ideological concerns as simply design concerns that you can overcome. It's just that it's fine to disagree. Disagreement makes these things better, but at a certain point, like, you have to actually make progress. And I think that's where we're falling behind. So I think it's just a matter of trying to get groups, communities together to decide what's best for the public trust. I mean, it's right there in the name. And privilege and public trust. Like, where is the public? How is the public accessing their own privilege? And if they don't want to, that's great, but don't complain about anything. Because if you don't have enough money, you don't have enough healthcare, you don't have all these things, but you're just being so privileged that you don't need to access it, then your opinion doesn't mean anything to me. So I hope that was a good enough answer, because it really is like a good question. Yeah.
Just following up on that.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking here in Greenfield, the folks who know the river here, in the Green River, we have 2 dams that I can think of that, one across from the Harbor's living facility and the one up by the Eunice Williams that are not used for power. But they haven't been used for power since the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the dams are still there, the state was actually going to pay us to take one of them out, and we refused to do that. But can those be used in an economically sensible way by, let's say, our municipality to put in a hydroelectric? And the reason they would wanted to take the dams out or because of the shad migration and stuff of that nature. So it's a 2-part question. One, can you have a dam that's that old with no infrastructure at all, just the dam? And then the second part, that when you work with environmental groups, to be able to really put in good enough, not just fish ladders, but I'll use that as an example, that satisfy both constituencies.
That's a complicated question, and I think it's a question that requires that you look at the individual site. I mean it's very specifically. And I think that wow, that's a really hard question. I would like to say the answer is yes, but I haven't seen the site. I think that the decision I think at some point there needs to be an investigation into whether or not there's any merit in developing it. If not, then it should be taken out. As far as there being infrastructure, in some ways that's actually easier, because you get into these old powerhouses that, when concrete was virtually free, they're so big and so thick that the biggest part of your construction cost is destruction. Like, you need to remove all the old infrastructure and rebuild within it or around it. So the physical state of it, as long as it's not crumbling, I think doesn't really matter if it doesn't have a lot of infrastructure other than the dam. And I think the way I'm going to answer your question. So Vermont Tissue, the thing we did, and it happened to do with, a friend of mine was a Northeast coordinator for the Sierra Club, and I had good access into trying to bring people to the table, which was a really important thing. And I think it was actually the environmental groups that got us to the project that we wanted to have, that was this win for all the stakeholders. So to some degree, it was their willingness to come to the table too, which is unusual. And I think Carol helped me a lot with that. So at Vermont Tissue, we were trying to find a compromise that wasn't where anybody had to compromise their values. It was a compromise of design. It was a compromise of, okay, let's not build it traditionally. How can we build this untraditionally to satisfy all the needs? I think what we found at the end of 20 years is that on a cash flow financial basis, all the sacrifices we made to put more water in the primary channel, substantially more, I mean like 5 or 6 times the volume that was required, and giving preference to the main channel, at the end of the day, we came up with a design that was like $1,000 difference at the end of 20 years. And that was the thing that I think made that suddenly for me, I'm like, why would you argue the environmental point then? What's the point in arguing the environment? It's $1,000 over 20 years, just build it that way. But I would point you to probably what I think everybody in the country and a lot of people outside of this country would say is the best model, which is the Penobscot Project. Has anybody heard of the Penobscot Project? It's a great example. 5 dams, I think. And they looked at the 5 dams. They looked at the value of each dam individually. There were tribal interests involved. There was the community. There was, recreation. I mean, fish migration. Like, the number of stakeholders in this one was massive, and this was all utility scale. And they rethought the problem, and they said, okay, what can we do? And the end result, which I think everybody was I think it was a win for all parties, just like Vermont Tissue, was the fact that they removed the lower 2 dams, number 1. So they freed up more miles of river. They took the next one, they didn't generate power, so they devoted a massive amount of water to a really elaborate fish ladder that seem to serve all the needs, but they kept the dam intact because there were so many recreational interests that nobody wanted to lose that. So they enhanced all the recreational aspects in the middle dam. Then they redesigned, I think, the equipment and the operating of the upper two dams such that they were making the same power or more as they were on all of the dams collectively when they went into this thing. So the relicensing really became about how do you satisfy all the concerns and try to find something that works for everybody. And it's a really good model. It's the model I would turn anybody to that asks that question of, should we take them out or not? What should we do? And if you have two, then I think it's a matter of looking at what makes the most sense in the long run. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I just don't know the specifics to the site. Yes?
Do you have any pictures of your?
Of the Vermont tissue one?
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to convey it.
Okay.
Because part of what we did with ours was to convert an ephemeral river, an ephemeral reach of river. So we're in a natural bedrock falls, which is a whole different thing to think about. Like if you're in a natural bedrock falls where there's no fish passage anyway, there's the aesthetic value of the waterfall and there is some aeration and other things, but the problems are different at every single site. So it's this site right here, which is, in the simplest way, there's an 85-foot dam here, there's an 80-foot dam parallel in the river, such that this bridge goes to an island. And then there's another bridge to go across. The ephemeral river is on the other side. It was dry 17% of the time. So one of the things we did is we matched the dam heights so that there's water over both dams all the time. And then we cut a big notch out of the other one so that we had not just the aesthetic flow, but we had good aquatic flow through the whole reach, and fish who could make it up to that point on the natural bedrock could easily clear that. The interesting thing we did, though, where I talked about sacrificing, is normally there's about a 300-foot stretch from here to where this converges back together. So this is the tail race, and it splits these two. About 300 feet of really good quality natural river that we would be bypassing. I'm going to go a little technical because it is a little technical, but essentially, if you wanted to make the most power, you always put it in your tail race, because your tail race, you have relatively flat water, and we have about 3.5 feet more head. That's what that wall is creating, is 3.5 feet more head, which, as we discussed, is about 35% more power. Maybe a little more than that because it compounds to a degree after in operation. So what we did is normally for this reach, so that you don't decrease the water quality, you would put in something called 7Q10, which sounds very complicated. It's the lowest, Q is always water, the lowest continuous flow for a 7-day period in the past 10 years. And that would be the standard, which I think is about 20 or 21 cubic feet per second on this site. So we would always have to put 21 cubic feet per second over the dam for aquatic concerns. So we kind of rethought this, and I went, wow, that's an awful lot of water on a small river, so what if we just diverted one turbine back into the main channel? I'm going to lose 35% power off the top on that turbine, but I can run it all the time because that first 21 in gets me operational up to 99.5% of the time. And that's where I get into that trade-off made sense. And not only that, but that's our preferred turbine of operation. That's the first one on, the last one off, so that we're pushing most of the river flow up to a really good, like really high baseline. I can't remember, 110 cubic feet per second, which is a pretty substantial amount of water, is always going into the primary channel, which is the better of the two aquatic habitats. And then this turbine comes on later and maxes out later. But that's kind of, I don't know if that's helping to explain all this, but that's kind of what we did here with this plan that was unconventional. Yes?
I don't know if I heard this correctly, but in your introductory remarks, I thought I heard something about with the redesign of these hydro dams and beginning to think of them again, we are actually finding ways to remove toxins in the water. And I'm wondering what element of the structures that you've pictured do that part.
Well, it's interesting. So that's a function of redevelopment as far as the toxins. So behind a dam, dams build up sediment. It's one of those things that's an environmental cost. Especially, this one doesn't really build up very much. It's too small. I mean, it hits full saturation in like a month or two and then no more can collect. So it'll stay mobilized straight through the plant. When we went in there, this whole area was filled with sediment. And actually this whole area was filled with sediment that was contaminated. Upstream was dioxin, downstream was dioxin, PCB, and lead. And I mean huge concentrations. When we pulled it out, it smelled, I couldn't figure it out. It took me 3 or 4 months. I'm like, it's not kerosene, what is it? We pulled it out and it was lead. So much lead that it smelled like a photo shop. I mean, it was just unbelievable how much lead was in the river. So one of the things that we end up doing when we redevelop these, so you have to get rid of the sediment as part of redevelopment. So we started working with Vermont and saying, okay, well, we should really start to take out anything that the dam has captured, which we may have to do at some point in time, especially at Pownell. Anything that's captured, because the sediment actually acts as a filter. So the finer particles end up filtering out things like dioxin and things like that, that are the particulates of that kind, the finer particulates. The bigger, the larger stone begins to filter out metals because it carries a magnetic charge to it. So you end up capturing metals and all these different things in the water that so if you look at that as opportunity and say, okay, I've got this artificial filter right at the dam, if I can come up with a regular maintenance plan to pull those things out, then I'm actually using it as a filter that I can clean regularly, and then we just ship it off to a solid waste landfill. The other plant, it was PCBs. A huge amount of PCBs, the only site of its kind in the country where you have contamination from one state depositing in a second state, which ended in 1972 with the Clean Water Act. Actually, it might have been 76 by the time it was fully implemented. And then continuing on down into the Hudson. What we realized with that is when we did our core sampling, because when you go in, the cost of testing is, the cost to actually get the material, to pull it out of the river, is way more than the test. So we're like, test for everything. It shut the lab down for 3 weeks. They couldn't get the equipment clean because there was so much DDT and cyanide in that river. Nobody even knew that was there. And the battery of things that were in there were unbelievable. But to think about the fact that the DDT was a worse concern than massive levels of PCBs. So let that sink in for a second. So what we ended up doing with that one is we just cofferdammed off the river and went in the dry and took all this stuff out, dewatered it, and it's all in a mined landfill now. So that's what, when we talk about cleaning up the toxins in the river, that's what I'm talking about.
And that design for maintenance is integrated into any project that you would take on?
Yes.
In most dams?
Most of them don't have the contamination problems we tend to deal with. Somehow I end up with all the toxic stuff. I don't know why, but so and I think that we're the only sites that have really done it. So I don't think that's been put out there, to use yet. It was unusual. Nobody knew how to do it in Vermont when we got to this. I mean, it was being done in the Hudson, but nobody had ever done it in Vermont. So we've done it twice in Vermont. It's been done twice in Vermont, and so that's. But no, there's just not a lot of development.
Thanks
I
for
think
that.
you were. Or actually, okay, yeah. Go right ahead.
I just want to follow up on this gentleman's description of the dams on the Green River here, because the first one is the Wyling Russell down near the Arbors.
Right.
That was a mechanical hydro in the day, 1800s, early 1900s. The next one you didn't mention, and I own the property next to it, is the Mill Street Dam.
Right.
And you don't even know it because it's under the bridge. A lot of
Right.
people miss it. But that was a hydroelectric plant up until 1960.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so is there any advantage to relicensing or reactivating if it has already been a hydro plant?
Well, I think that's a super technical question. I think that licensing in general is going to be the same thing no matter. The challenge can be the same. There's interesting doors that open though if the equipment's still there because it's easy to get an exemption.
No,
from
there's no
licensing, but-
equipment, but again, then the other questions I have is, we're not even sure who owns the water rights. In Massachusetts, all the towns own the dams, the way I understand it. That was, so the town owns these dams, but who owns the water rights? Because eventually you've got to have the water rights.
It'll be in the deed. They're usually really specifically detailed. I don't know how Massachusetts does it, to be honest with you. Vermont tissues are really strange one because it predates the state. So we go back to old English law, and actually we own the water and the fish in it. If somebody comes and steals ice in the winter, it's technically a theft. So ours is really weird. Like there aren't a lot that predate like state and federal law. Pownell is more specific. I think you'd have to look at the deeds, but the deeds are usually clear. I'm working on a project in Swanton, Vermont, where there was a municipally owned dam, and I think there were 2 different privileges, at least 2 that I know of on either side of the river, and they refer to, they're both restricted up to a certain diameter pipe. So that, I mean, like in inches, you can only have a pipe this big for your water draw. Other ones the same thing. Some of them will be in cubic feet per second if they're more modern. But I think that's where you're going to find, somewhere in the deed, there'll be a description of the rights. Somebody has those water rights, I would imagine. I mean, I can't imagine, especially in an area like this.
Originally it was the Greenfield Electric Power Company.
then the deed that they had, if they were making power off it, it will be somewhere in that deed transfer they had to have the right to use the water.
We're assuming that Northeast Utilities or, whoever would have inherited the water rights. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I mean, it will be in the land, in the land records, though. I mean, it has to be recorded in the land records somewhere.
Right.
Just because it's a real property, it's public. Even if it's a public trust property, or public trust applies, it has to be detailed specifically as a real property right.
So, can I just, one more question? I mean, is there any aspect that you could describe that would just make it totally impossible to bring this back as a hydro plant? Where do we start if we want to look into redeveloping this thing? It's a very hard area to get into. We had an initial survey done that it appears it's worth doing. I mean, for the power it could put out.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, what are the other, other pitfalls that could make it just totally impossible to do?
The first thing I would find out is the water rights. You can't do it without the water rights. Then I would look into really simply the formula for the potential, because that's going to give you the potential. It's going to give you, there's a whole lot more. Like I mentioned, gross head, you have to get the net head because friction is a variable. I mean, there are things that are going to matter too that are going to keep bringing that number down, but figure out the range that
You
you're
have the
in.
historical data of the production of that.
Yeah, then that's a good place to start. If you have that, then
Yeah.
you can figure out if it's worth it. You need to look into the local programs, but the real thing is, once you do the rough-in sketch and you don't get too invested, you've spent a day or two working on it, you've kind of figured out what it might mean to you, strictly financially, because ultimately if it doesn't make sense financially, and you're not just looking to throw away money, then you aren't going to be able to build it. So, in the most basic level, figure out if you can build it, and you can talk to somebody about generally what it costs per kilowatt to build a plant, the building part of it, like the concrete and all the other stuff. And then take a hard look at the environmental impacts, and figure out, start to think of, for me, I think I'm unique in saying this, but start to look at how you would incorporate environmental impacts as part of your design concern. Because if you can't, I had immediate ways that it made sense to me, and I thought through it, and I had a lot of help from people to get to that point, people who knew more than me. So I had design concern, I had the design concerns, I had the ideological stuff worked into my design in a way that made sense and I could live with it. But I worked that out pretty early on, like way before I was, deep into the licensing. I was thinking about what my values were going to be and how they were going to be instilled into this project. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it all makes sense.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, no, we're pressed for time. So I'm over in Turner's, Mike Jackson, right for the Montague Reporter. So there's three projects where we are. There's the pump storage at Northfield Mountain, owned by First Light, and then First Light also owns Cabot Station at the end of the power canal. But the third kind of thing is between the canal and the river is the original canal that the Turner's Falls company built for hydromechanical. There's all these rights in the lots that go through it, and at this point we have a situation where the power company, which is now owned by a Canadian company, etc., owns all of the land encircling this land. That's with the industrialization, the land inside of it has just kind of one by one become publicly owned.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 summers ago, the last mill, Southworth Mill, closed abruptly one day. Come on, you're fired.
Yeah, I remember. I read about that.
And that company isn't even successfully in bankruptcy right now. It's just kind of totally up in the air. Cups of coffee rotting on the desks and stuff, from what I've heard. And they're doing all this clean out of materials that were in there. But that had a turbine on site. That was part of their operations. I'm assuming it's not huge.
That's the paper mill, right?
It was a paper mill.
Yeah,
And
I know
then
the people that rebuilt that. The Fay Engineering redid that in like 5 years ago.
Southworth. So that's a rebuild. That's a recent
Yeah,
turbine rebuild.
yeah. Bill and
Okay.
Will and Celeste Fay rebuilt that. Yeah.
Well, and then a couple doors up the canal, the Turner's Falls Hydro, which is my understanding. It's the last turbine that's been running for hydroelectric generation based on the canal, and I don't know what percent of the time it is, but I've heard it's a pretty significant amount of their of the time in a year. First Light is paying them not to make use of their right not to run the turbine, and the cost benefit just goes to, they're basically collecting money from the power company to own a turbine that they're not using.
Yeah.
And I guess, I mean, I'll leave that aside because they own it and that's cool. But this question of Southworth, which might become
Southworth, yeah.
publicly, I mean, it's probably, you know, it's going into tax taking, and you know, it's Montague has a pretty good shot at just kind of having this thing. What would you suggest based on what you know about, you know, that situation? Is that something that the town should be trying to split that off from the rest of the building and try to have like a publicly owned?
Splitting it off is hard, but it can be done. The FERC doesn't like it, but I've seen it done. It was actually done at the Hoosick property. It's actually had to be split by deed into 2 different parcels because one is Superfund and one is Brownfield. So you're asking a complicated question. So if I give you just the like Bill Scully's Greenland answer to your problem, you know, I think that when you have something like that, and again, I don't know a lot about the utility. If it were me and I just had control over everything, I would go in looking at like the focus of the people who are interested in this and the focus of the people in this conference. And I would look at trying to, I would try to consolidate all of the water rights, period, and take a lot of abandoned mill space and turn that into a single large power plant because it's more efficient. So you have to think about when that was built and people were vying over water privilege, everybody was trying to use enough power locally for a mechanical thing in which the power could not be transmitted outside the building. It was powered by a belt or a shaft. We have electricity now. We have electrical infrastructure. So there's a lot of benefit to try to, like, for a lot of reasons. Like, there would be a huge benefit if you could get the first mill or 2, get a property that's close to the headwaters and turn that into the maximum power plant that you could build, and then try to not use the rest of the power canal. Send that water back into the river. Shorten what's called your bypass reach, because that's a really long canal. And if you could actually take that canal, and I'm assuming again without looking at the environmental impact in the canal, but try to transfer that water back into the primary channel, into what's being bypassed now, you would get a big environmental win for sure, because you'd be putting the water to a better aquatic habitat, but you'd also be consolidating into a much more efficient power plant. Is that enough power to power the local area? I don't know. But that's where I would start. I would try to buy up all the water rights and consolidate them, or as many of them as I could.
Well, I mean, I think most of what's going in the power canal, they did this huge extension then of the canal in the hydroelectric era and built Kappa Station at the end. So the original, the rights that you know, initial canal in town kind of had, I don't think that they're large relative to how much water is going to the overall canal.
Yeah, I just need to look at it. Like, I don't know, but I would start just with an Excel spreadsheet of water rights and try to figure out, like, geographically who has right to what in sequence along the path, and figure out the plan that collected that centralized the most potential energy, or its actual energy, but centralized the most power, and then figure out, okay, where does that sit in sequence that I could divert a lot of it back into the main channel? What's the best design? So as you go further downriver, you get more power too. So you need to build a really complicated calculator, which we build for all these sites to actually vet specific equipment for specific flows, for specific heads, and you can go in and start to toggle those values around, and you come out with something that in the end you can figure out what makes the most sense financially. Because ultimately it does have to be financially viable, and then you can start to look, you start a whole separate set of project economics on the environmental impacts. And somewhere between the financial economics and the social economics and the environmental economics, the right decisions start to bubble to the surface. It's hard to get to the actual best one, but that's where you have stakeholders and you go talk to those people. So, thanks. Yes?
Can we just come back to the question that Paul raised and that we didn't, I think, finish addressing, which is your model on the right there, that Northfield Mountain uses to pump water overnight from the Connecticut up to the reservoir, and then they sell it back during peak hours, and it has, from what I understand, devastating impacts. Would you, to the ecology of the Connecticut, would you argue that those impacts are probably due to market pressures and the way that First Light acts, and they're not endemic to the model that you're talking about?
I'm going to give you a whole bunch of quick answers that are not going to satisfy you. Okay. Number one, we're way outside of my wheelhouse. Number two, start to think about the impacts. Would you rather have climate change or a small section of river that's damaged? You know, I just don't know the players and I don't know the site, so it's hard for me to actually answer that because, and again, pump storage, there's different kinds. The one that you're talking about is like this one, it's on a river. There are plenty of them that are just completely isolated. But I don't know, and I think it would be really naive of me to try to answer that question because I think there's too much going on. But in the big picture, even if there are environmental impacts, that's where you have to look at, are these environmental impacts for this reach of river, how do those balance out against a global problem of can Africa feed itself in 15 years? And I don't know. I don't pretend to know the answer to that. I have my own personal opinion. But I also don't think we should go running roughshod and just diverting every river and leaving every... I think that we need to be concerned about the health of the river, because if I, as a developer, am not concerned about the river, but I'm all about climate change, what am I about? So, you know... Anyway, does that answer your question as well as I can? Okay, you had a question.
This is probably also way off base, but at one conference I heard many years ago, someone was talking about low head hydro inside of water systems, you know, sewer pipes, water pipes. Do you know anything about that?
Bennington has one. Bennington put one in. It's like putting it in the plumbing. It is FERC regulated, but you bypass a whole lot, so you don't need to go through. The state will find a way to vest its right, but in a hydro plant, typically the way the state vests its rights, as I mentioned, is through the 72 Clean Water Act, something called it's the Section 401 Water Quality Certificate. So you get to bypass that in some ways. You have to prove that water quality isn't impacted, but you're not worried about trout migration, or it's got salmon migration. Trout don't migrate so much. But you don't have to worry about fish movement, you don't have to worry about temperature, you don't have to worry about oxygenation. Like, there's a whole battery of really important things that you just get to not worry about. But you still have to go through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission licensing or exemption process. I think probably exemptions are a lot easier. But yeah, Bennington has one. There's a lot of people looking at them. I think that I think they're a great idea. I think if you've got excess energy, you should use it in some way other than creating friction or resistance that you can't harness. So I hope that helps. And I didn't do the Bennington project myself, but I could refer you to people that know more about it.
Very quickly, maybe I get very confused when I hear the broad term stakeholders.
Yep.
In a town like Greenfield. What would be a potential list of stakeholders for perhaps the small 3 dam on Green River?
The easiest way is think about people who so it's a public trust, which means that a broad set of people. So obviously the neighbors are going to be your stakeholders. I would then go to, it's a waterway, so who uses that waterway? Well, I would put Trout Unlimited on that list. I would put, I don't know if the Connecticut Valley, what is it? I forget the Connecticut Valley Watershed. I don't know if they, can't remember the name. They're very active in Vermont. What is it?
Council.
Yeah, oh, council, gotcha. I would definitely, like, if you're an in-feed to that, like, I would, even if you're not on the Connecticut River, I would certainly list them because they're concerned about in-feeds to the Connecticut River and the general basin. So you think about the Sierra Club is a group you might think about, although their opinion is more dam removal than hydro development. I mean, those are two different things. So it isn't they really always get involved in hydro development, but they are involved in dam removal. So if you have a dam they want to remove, you're probably going to want to talk to them. But if you're in a river section that they're not too worried about, they're not even going to get involved. The Nature Conservancy, another group I would think about. I would think that if you could get a hold of any of the two, like Trout Unlimited, by example, and the Connecticut River Council.
Conservancy.
Or the Conservancy, like they could help you through because they're going to be working collaboratively on other water issues in the area. So if you could you need to figure out if there's tribal interests. So I think we deal with Mohawk when we're dealing with the Walloomsac, and actually the Hoosick, both of those end up as a subdivision of the Mohawk Nation. So tribal interest is another one.
What about the town council?
I like to involve the town. They aren't always stakeholders, but it's usually a good idea to involve them.
Well, thank you. That clarifies for me. Thank you.
Yeah, there's going to be, that's kind of where you want to head with it, is think about the aquatic, think about the physical around you, and think about like the politics of it.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. The regulatory area grows because eventually your Army Corps of Engineers, if you're going to be building in the river and all these other things, but it's really far down the line, and people will tell you that you need to go deal with that. They won't let you overlook it. So, was there a question back there? Did one of you two have a question? Okay.
Well, I do have a question, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I live in a small town in
Connecticut where there are two reservoirs that are owned by the water authority. They have dams and then kind of a sluice where they let water through. So is that a ridiculous situation for trying to put in hydropower or?
I think you need to look at it. And again, I hate to say it, but I hated when people said this to me when I first got started, that everything is a case-by-case basis. And it really is true. Like when you look at a site, every site is going to have unique concerns. And that's why I tried to convey the calculator so that you could at least in some way look at how much value, and monetarily, how much value does this have, as a way of starting to say, if it makes me this much a year, long term, does this make sense for me? And then you can, the other things become ways of achieving that. You work your way through the process. But I think you would need to know more, which is why I try to hand out the tool, and it's why at Bennington College we're going to be doing workshops up there, so you could come in and say, you know, I'm looking at this area, and bring a couple pictures, and we'll send you back out and say, we need you to gather this, and this data, and then the next time we're going to tell you what you could possibly build, and if you want to go forward from there, here's where you would go. But in a session or two on a Saturday, people could come away knowing, having some way of quantifying this thing that they're trying to identify, and also where they would step off and begin to do that if it made sense to them. Because I think it's funny because I stand here and it's now like videos and people talking about it, but it used to be, there's all these old water wheel books, and I think it's some from around here, like McCormick was making water wheels, and they're all designed for farmers and for people who were doing things on their own, like people that were running foundries. And it tells you, like, okay, you have a river, cut a board like this wide, and here's how you measure your flow. And it talked to people like on a very practical level, like anybody who picked up the book could go look at a river. And I think that we've got so much internet out there now that it's impossible to find all this really useful data that's way better than what those books had. But 150 years ago, everybody knew what I'm telling you right now. So, you know, it's interesting to be in a world like that. But I want to try to make those tools accessible so that people, if for no other reason, can have fun thinking through the problem, because it's a lot of fun to really think through those sites and what their potential could be.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank William.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.